In His Grip with Dr. Chuck Betters of Mark Inc. Ministries. Today we are reaching back into the archives. Today's message is titled, The Church Lax in Discipline, from the series Unveiling and Understanding Revelation. Each message is designed to help turn your heart towards Jesus and equip you to walk by faith. Let's join Dr. Betters in the sanctuary.
We're going to look again at the letters to the churches. This one in particular, the church at Pergamum. We'll look at the city, we'll look at the letter, and we'll look at some applications. You know, the other day, I heard of the fact that Frank Sinatra was in New Jersey. He is called the chairman of the board. Now, I don't know what board they're referring to, but it was interesting to me that one of the songs that made Frank Sinatra famous is what I believe is the song they will be singing in hell. I did it my way. And when you stop and think about it, isn't that true? I did it my way. Forget what God did or is doing or will do. What's important in life is whether or not I do it my way. That's the problem that the Pergamus church had. They did it their way. And to that church is a very strong exhortation. They were known as the city of authority. Even the terrain that surrounded the city was an imposing terrain. It stood on a rocky hill, and it was huge. And it dominated the broad plains below proudly and boldly. It was a city made up of political authority. In 133 BC, the Romans formed Pergamum as a part of an entire province of Asia and made Pergamum the capital of the province of Asia. And so it became the seat of supreme authority in the whole province of Asia. And for the next 4 centuries, it would occupy that position of supreme authority and power. When you read the Revelation chapter 2 and 3, John is telling us that Pergamum was the seat of Satan's throne, the seat of his power. Now, we do not know whether or not that means that Satan actually dwelt there, or that the satanic system of evil was prevalent and dominant there. Suffice it to say that Pergamum represented the seat or the throne of Satan's authority. It was literally a hell on earth. That authority was exercised in 2 ways. First, there was a civil authority given to the proconsul, to the one who was appointed by Rome to exercise the authority and the power of Rome in the province of Asia. And second, there was an official state religion carried out by the Pergaminian people themselves. And so from the civil perspective and from the religious perspective, Satan held his throne in Pergamum. The city laid many claims to greatness. Knowledge and culture, had the largest public library in the ancient world. Over 200,000 parchments were located in that library. In fact, the word parchment comes from the same derivative as the word Pergamum. Pergamum means, in one sense, the city of parchments. So knowledge and culture was extremely important to them. And so were their ancient pagan goddesses and gods. 4 patron deities sprinkled through the city of Pergamum: Zeus, Athena, Dionysos, Asclepios. 4 prominent patron deities of the city formed the seat of Satan, as John says. Zeus sat on top of a 800-foot conical-shaped hill. The statue of Zeus was 40 feet high and stood out on a projected ledge atop of the hill. Maybe that's what John had in mind when he spoke of the seat of Satan's authority. It stuck out, it kind of jutted out for everyone to see that this city had bowed its knee to their patron deities. 24 hours a day, that shrine smoked with the incense of sacrifices, and around its base was carved a sculpture showing the victory that the gods had achieved over their enemies. And then there was Asclepios, another one of their patron deities. He was the god of healing, and wealthy people would make pilgrimages from all over the world to be touched by the statues and by the relics of Asclepios, hoping for healing from the gods. Its temples were the next best thing to first-century hospitals that you could think of. Pilgrimage from all over the world would make Lourdes look small in comparison. They were an imperialistic city. In Pergamum, there sat the seat of emperor worship. Every year, each citizen of Pergamum was required to show their patriotism by doing one thing: take a little pinch of incense, make a pilgrimage into Pergamum where the temple or the shrine to Caesar was erected, and burn a little incense and say simply 3 words: Caesar is Lord. And you would then be given a certificate that shows you were a patriotic Pergaminian. But the Christians, you see, had real difficulty saying that. They had a lot of trouble saying Caesar is Lord. Now, you see, after you did that, you were free to worship any way you wanted to. You could be a Christian. You could be a Jew. You could worship Zeus. You could worship Dionysos. You could worship Asclepios. You could worship any of the gods you wanted to worship, so long as once a year you went through that little ritual where you pinched a little pinch of incense, burned it to Caesar in his temple, and said, Caesar is Lord. Then you're free to do whatever you want to do. Otherwise, you face the risk of the eos gladii, that is the power of the sword that was given to the proconsulate in Asia. Literally, he held in his hands the right to snuff out your life with the sword. That is why when you read verse 12 of Revelation chapter 2, you see that he says, to the angel in the church in Pergamum write, these are the words of him who has the sharp, double-edged sword. Obviously a reference to the eos gladii, the power of the sword of the proconsulate. Notice what he tells these people as he commends them. I know where you live. I know where you live, where Satan has his throne, yet you remain true to my name. You did not renounce your faith in me, even in the days of Antipas, my faithful witness, who was put to death in your city, where Satan lives. Notice 2 times in those verses, he makes reference to the fact, I know where you live. And I know that where you live is where Satan lives. I know where you live. Literally, the translation, I know where you have to stay. I know you cannot get away from it. I know you cannot run out of this world. I know what you must be going through. I know the limitations that living in the city of Satan brings with it. I know the life you must have to live. I know your lot. I know the place where Satan dwells. I know his battleground. I know his MO. I know what he does and where he goes and how he responds and how he acts. And I know what you must have to endure living there. Isn't it interesting? Can you hear the Lord Jesus saying to you, I know where you live. I know where you have to stay. I know the conditions you're faced with every day of your life. I know the battles you have to do with the devil. I know the temptations you're going through. I know those secret thoughts. I know those questions. I know all about those doubts. I know all about the things that Satan is throwing at you from one direction and another. I know where you live. And he says there, yet you remain true to my name. You've been faithful. In the midst of those surroundings, in the center of Satan's dwelling place, you have been faithful. Notice he doesn't command them to leave the area. Notice he doesn't say to them, even though Satan lives there, I want you to leave. I want you to get out. He does not call them to leave. He calls them to be faithful in the midst of their surroundings. You see, that's the purpose of the incarnation. That's the whole idea behind Christmas. That is why Christmas is so important to the believer. We are saying that God left the surrounds and the confines of the glories of heaven and came down to where Satan lives and experienced the whip of Satan and the hatred of Satan and the venom of Satan and the temptations of Satan. And yes, even the pain of death that is the result of the sin of the fallen world in which we live. God becomes a man so that he can say, I know where you live. I know what you're going through because I've experienced it myself. Yet he does not call us to leave it. As he did not leave it, he endured it. He went to the cross and despised the shame. He resisted with his own blood. God incarnate, going to a cross and bearing my sins so that he will remember my sins no more. That's an incarnate God who says, yes, you remain true to my name. They're not commanded to leave their surroundings. Listen, they're commanded to transform their surroundings. And that's where the Pergaminian church had a problem. They weren't asked to leave. God didn't say leave. He said transform. He said change it. Stay in the middle of it. Radiate the love of Christ. Preach the gospel of Christ. Remain faithful to my name. And transform your culture. Be faithful in the midst of this satanic humanism, this man-centered religion. Notice he tells them in verse 13, you did not renounce your faith in me. I want to tell you, this church was not made up of people who proclaimed a silent witness. They held to a public witness. Now, reference is made to one Antipas, who was evidently martyred. It seems as though that martyrdom was in the past and that persecution had already peaked, and now they were living in relative peace. But you see, what had happened in the light of the murder of Antipas, they would have been given every reason to be put to flight, to leave the city, to escape for their lives. But they didn't. Antipas is called the same name that Jesus is called. I don't know if you picked that up or not, but in chapter 1, verse 5, Jesus is called the faithful and true witness. In chapter 3, verse 14, Jesus is called the faithful and the true witness. The word witness here is the word martyr. It's the word martyrios in the Greek. It's the same word we get martyr from. Antipas is called my faithful and true martyr. He set the standard. He was the standard bearer for that church. And they put him to death. Evidently, he refused to take that little pinch of incense and burn it in the temple of the Caesars and say, Caesar is Lord. And thus it cost him, through eos gladii, the power of the sword, it cost him his life. But he says, you did not renounce your faith in me. You had the chance to flee, but you didn't. You've stayed there. You've remained true to my name. Sounds good so far, doesn't it? Until you drop down to verses 14 and 15. He says, nevertheless, I have a few things against you. You have people there who hold to the teaching of Balaam, who taught Balak to entice the Israelites to sin by eating food sacrificed to idols and by committing sexual immorality. Likewise, you also have those who hold to the teaching of the Nicolaitans. You see, that Old Testament story is the story of Balak, who was the king of the Moabites. And he wanted to defeat the enemy, Israel, who were the people of God. And so Balak decided to hire Balaam, who was a Jew, and said to him, now, I want you to curse your nation, because you see, if you can place a curse on Israel, then I can defeat them. And so, like Judas Iscariot, for a few pieces of silver, he sold out and agreed to go and curse the Israelites. But while he was on his way, the angel of God stopped him dead in the middle. And through his mule, he began to speak to him. The mule actually began to talk. And as the result of that, Balaam decided not to curse Israel. But when he got there to the Moabites, when he got there to where Balak was and refused to curse Israel, he did something that was even more severe, something that was very shrewd. You see, in one sense, he listened to God in that he didn't curse Israel. But he tiptoed around and compromised the issue. Although he didn't curse them, he gave some advice to Balak, the king of Moab. He said to Balak, now I'll tell you what you do. Here's what you've got to do. Get your Moabite women to marry the Jewish men. Get your men and your women interacting sexually and committing acts of fornication against Israel. And do you know what will happen, Balak? There will be such an intermarriage and an interconnection between them as they represent the world and the people of God as they are represented in Israel. There will be such an interconnection. You know what's going to happen? They will lose their distinctiveness as the people of God, and you'll be able to wipe them out. And it is that story that God brings home to this church in Pergamum. He says to them, you've held fast. Like Antipas, my servant, you have held fast. But you also have compromised. Even though you have stayed in the surroundings, even though you haven't been put to flight, you have lost your distinctiveness by morally and scripturally compromising what you believe. There are some in your church who hold to the doctrines of Balaam and the doctrines of the Nicolaitanes. You see, what happened is that in the midst of this persecution of Antipas, evidently what happened was that on the heels of that martyrdom, many of the people in that church didn't have a problem grabbing a little incense. I mean, it's just a little bit, isn't it? What's the big deal about a little pinch of incense? I just go in there for 5 minutes, burn my incense, blare out the words, Caesar is Lord. Doesn't mean anything to me. It's no big deal. I still hold my faith. I still believe in Jesus. I'm still a Christian. I still don't have any problems proclaiming my faith. My government allows me to do that. What's the big deal about a little incense? And there were people in the church who began to preach that doctrine. And it caught on. And so what they did is they sought to adjust their Christianity to the level of the world. And they developed a policy of moral laxity and compromise. And you know what happened? They lost their distinctiveness. Why, friends? Because the man who is not prepared, listen, the man who is not prepared to be different is not prepared to be a Christian. Do you hear what I said? The man who is not prepared to be different is not prepared to be a Christian. All the pitfalls of Satan are many. He abuses grace. He says it doesn't really matter what you do because you're under grace. You're covered by the blood of Christ. He forgave all your sins. What's the big deal? Don't worry about it. It's okay. Don't worry about a little bit of sin. You can just confess it the next day. Get it over with. No problem. Immorality. There's no problem with immorality. Little compromise never hurt anybody. I mean, didn't God create me this way with this body? Didn't He create me with these temptations? What's a little compromise? What's a little flirtation? What's a little affair? What's a little immorality? You see what happens, friends, when we begin to throw a little bit, just a little pinch of incense into the altars of the world, we begin to lose our distinctiveness as the people of God. That is why I've entitled this message, The Church Lax in Discipline. They had the same problem the Corinthian church had. You remember that story in 1 Corinthians 5, where in that congregation there was a man who was carrying on an affair with his stepmother? And because he was wealthy and influential, nobody dared to take him on. And Paul says to that Corinthian church, purge that man from among you. Discipline that man. He speaks of a little leaven leavening the whole lump. What's the big deal about a little sin? As though there are little sins and big sins. Why, what others do in the privacy of their own homes is no concern to me. It's none of my business. And he says to that church, You are there as the sentinels to guard the discipline. You are there to guard the doctrines of the church, because the people of God are called to be distinctive people. And the man who's not prepared to be different is not prepared to be a Christian. Notice what he says in verse 16. He says, "Repent therefore, otherwise I will soon come to you and will fight against them with the word of my mouth."
Thank you for listening to In His Grip, a ministry of Mark Inc. You just listened to the first part of Dr. Better's message titled, "The Church Lacks in Discipline," from the series Unveiling and Understanding Revelation. You can download the full sermon at www.markinc.org. Visit us online at markinc.org, where you will find many free resources that offer help and hope to the hurting. Please help us keep In His Grip on the air with your gifts. Visit markinc.org, where you can safely give, or call us toll-free at 877-MARK-INC. No gift is too small. Thank you for listening and for your support.